When morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death, and they bound him and led him away and delivered him to Pilate, the governor. When Judas, his betrayer, saw that he was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying,
I have sinned in betraying innocent blood. It is not my law to put them into the treasury, since they are blood money.
So they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. Therefore that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken by the prophet Jeremiah, saying, And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him on whom a price had been set by some of the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him,
Are you the king of the Jews?
But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor wondered greatly. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. And they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they had gathered, Pilate said to them,
Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?
For he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him,
Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much over him today in a dream.
Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the people to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor again said to them,
Which of the two do you want me to release for you?
And they said, Barabbas. Pilate said to them,
Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?
They all said, And he said,
Why? What evil has he done?
But they shouted all the more,
Let him be crucified.
So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying,
I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves.
And all the people answered, Then he released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. Then the soldier of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe upon him, and plaiting a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and put a reed in his right hand. And kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, And they spat upon him and took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him and led him away to crucify him. As they were marching out, they came upon a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. This man they compelled to carry his cross. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink, mingled with gall, but when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And when they had crucified him, they divided his garments among them by casting lots, and they sat down and kept watch over him there. And over his head they put the charge against him, which read, This is the Jesus, the King of the Jews. Then 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, You would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. Save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. So also the chief priests with the scribes and elders mocked him, saying, He saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, if he desires him. For he said, I am the Son of God. And the robbers who were crucified with him also reviled him in the same way. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice,
Ele, Ele, lama sabachthani.
that is,
My God, why hast thou forsaken me?
and some of the bystanders, hearing it, said, and one of them at once ran and took a sponge, filled it with vinegar, and put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink. But the others said, and Jesus cried again with a loud voice, and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. When the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said,
Truly, this was the Son of God.
Allie was a young girl who had an autoimmune deficiency disease. That meant that she could not go outside with her friends because any time that she was exposed to sun, her skin would turn white. The fact that she couldn't go out and play with her friends made her different than her friends, and she didn't like to feel that way. But if she was ever exposed to sun and that skin turned white, everybody looked at her and asked hard questions or not made fun of her. You see, Allie discovered that it was very, very hard to be different than other kids. Then Allie discovered a camp that she went to called Camp Knutson. It's a camp sponsored by Lutheran Social Service where they invite people like Allie who have different diseases and different disabilities to come when they can be together with other kids that feel the same way that they do. And they don't have to explain why their skin turns white or why they have to take an insulin shot or why they have to do some other things or take medication. Everybody understands that and they're accepted in the family. But Allie said something. She said, it takes courage to be different. Friends, that's the bottom line of Palm Sunday. When Jesus was entering Jerusalem with the sounds of praise and that proclamation of him being the king, within days that praise was silenced with a cry to crucify him. And why that all happened is because Jesus was different. Jesus was so different with a message that threatened the message of the powers to be, the religious authorities that wanted things under control, and Jesus wouldn't let that happen. And the reason is because Jesus embraced everybody, and they wanted only certain kinds of people to be embraced. Jesus was willing to let those who were labeled as sinners and outcasts to be his friends and go eat with them. He went to the home of a tax collector that was hated by everybody, and by so doing, he was really saying that, I want to be your friend. And then there was a gentleman by the name of Zacchaeus who was disliked too and had to go up in a tree to find Jesus, and he invited him to come down, and Jesus said, I want to go to your home, saying, I want to get to know you. You see, Jesus broke all of those cultural and, yes, even religious codes that were written by people that made people feel like if they kept them perfectly, then they are in right standing with God. But Jesus was so different. He was so different. He was willing to talk to this woman at a well. And the culture of that day said if you're going to be a true Jew and good standing, you wouldn't talk to a female in public. Jesus did and asked her for a drink of water. And after she told him all of her background, and she was probably not sure she should tell him everything, Jesus said, that's okay. No matter what's in your history, I will love you just the same. And then Jesus would be willing to bring his disciples into areas called Samaria, places where the religious powers of that day said, you can't go there because they're not pure like the rest of us. But Jesus brought them there. You see, what Jesus was really saying is that his message was so different because it was for everybody, not for a select few. And that's why Jesus was different for the religious powers that were waiting for him in Jerusalem. Jesus was so different. Because Jesus' definition of good news of God's presence in the world was one that was love for all. It did not depend on who the people were, what they did. It all came as a gift because God wants to give it. Friends, if we understand that different message of Jesus, maybe we can understand a little bit more why the religious authorities were trying to convince the crowds to turn the term from praise to crucify him. Were you there? No, we probably weren't on that parade route where Jesus was proclaimed as king. But maybe we've experienced other places where we've been touched by that different kind of a love that really woke us up to say, this is different. 2 weeks ago I experienced that. It was on the University St. Thomas campus. There was a state swim meet for the Special Olympics. And there I saw this radical, different love in action again. My son, Ryan, swam together with many of his friends who were able to get to the swim meet 2 weeks ago. But guiding Ryan and all of his other friends who needed help, and Ryan needs a lot of assistance getting from point A to point B, doesn't quite understand, there were volunteers, hundreds of volunteers, maybe up to 1,000 volunteers that are in an aquatic center, helping all of these special people get to where they needed to go, and they did it with such grace. And watching these special athletes swim in their swim meet is the most moving thing I could ever imagine, because not only we as parents are cheering, but these volunteers are cheering their hardest for every single one. And the one who comes through, of course, gets cheers, but guess what? The part that I still get goosebumps and I have a hard time talking about is the way that these volunteers cheer even louder for the one that struggles to finish the race many seconds and maybe minutes after everybody else is completed. You see, these volunteers have been expressions of that different kind of a love that says that even though our culture defines what it means to be a winner is that only those who come in first or second or third and the others really don't count, Special Olympics is saying everybody counts the same. Why? Because you don't earn the title winner. You are already given it before you get into the pool. Ryan's buddy Jacob was sitting by him in the waiting line to get up to the award ceremony. And a friend of Jacob's came by and asked, Jacob, how did you do in your swim meet? And he gave the biggest smile you could ever imagine. And he said, I came in last. Well, the truth of the matter is he didn't come in last. He came in fourth. My son came in last. It didn't make any difference. And I sat there and listening to that conversation, I said, there's that different message of what it means to live in a world where God says everybody's winners, no matter where you come in first, second, third, or sixth. You see, Jesus was different, all right? Because love was the order of his day. Not proving or earning approval from other people, or certainly not from God. Jesus came saying, my wish for you is that you learn to wash each other's feet as he did to his disciples, and you have compassion in your heart to care for one another, and especially those that are on the margins of life. You see, that compassion and that love is what trumps everything else that is man-made that makes us religious. Friends, the good news today is that Jesus doesn't want to make us into religious people. He wants to change us with a different kind of a love that helps us to see the world differently, where everybody's winners and we are a part of cheering others on, and maybe in our assistance being there as Jesus' hands and feet to those in need. You don't have to be good enough. You don't have to do anything to earn it. Jesus said it's a matter of simply understanding that God's greatest desire is to give it to you. In a few minutes, there are going to be 11 adults who have been through a class learning about this radical love in the catechism. And these 11 adults are going to go through what we call confirmation. Many of us experienced earlier in our lives, but they had not. In this affirmation of baptism, these 11 people are going to say something bold and courageous, because they're committing themselves to this radical, different kind of a love of Jesus, where they're uniting themselves with Jesus in a new way and saying, I wish to walk with Jesus in serving all people, striving for justice and peace in all the earth. Friends, to affirm our baptism isn't baking a cake and calling a party. It's a call to be different. To be united with the Jesus who would be willing to walk into Jerusalem, knowing that the sounds of the parade were going to simply turn around, and that he was willing to suffer for the people that couldn't do anything to earn their own salvation. We are called to seek Christ's love, where hate and fear's voice is screaming so loudly. All of us, as we follow Jesus in this different kind of love, are called to serve and embrace the refugee, whoever they are and wherever they might be, and the widows and the children and others who have been abandoned and forced by dictators and others who have been careless with oppressive leadership. Our questions are not where you come from, but is how can we be Christ's hands and feet for you? This is the call to be different with Christ's radical love. Allie was right, wasn't she? It takes courage to be different. Our courage to be marked with the cross is based on knowing the rest of the Holy Week story. You see, death and suffering does not have the final word for Jesus or for us. The resurrection and the promise of life always does. And until then, we are united with Jesus, who rode into Jerusalem with a different way of revealing God's grace and hope. And knowing the rest of the story, we dare to join with Jesus in riding into harm's way of oppression and injustice and saying, we want to be reflections of Christ's love here and now. Ride on, my friends. Ride on. And whether you are here with the laying on hands of the 11 who are being affirmed in their baptism, where we sit in the pews, may we all be able to hear the invitation to ride on with Jesus, knowing that, in fact, with this different kind of a love, we may be walking into conflict with a radically different kind of sacrificial love. But in following this calling of Jesus, we hear the good news that we dare to courageously be different and to reach out to a world with a voice of radical hope.